So let's get started. Our next presentation is titled Arguing Generatively and Persuasively, and our speakers are Richard Johnson-Sheehan and Charles Paine. Richard Johnson-Sheehan is a professor of rhetoric and composition at Purdue University, where he has directed the introductory composition program and mentored new teachers of composition for many years. He teaches a variety of courses in composition and professional writing, as well as in classical rhetoric and the rhetoric of science, and he has published widely in these areas. He was awarded the 2008 Fellow of the Association of Teachers of Technical Writing and has been an officer in the Council for Writing Program Administrators. He is the co-author with Charles Paine of Writing Today, as well as the soon-to-be-released book Argument Today, which will be published by Pearson this summer. Charles Paine is a professor of English at the University of New Mexico, where he directs the undergraduate writing program and teaches courses in first-year, intermediate, and professional writing. He is an active member of the Council of Writing Program Administrators and currently serves on its executive board. He co-founded and coordinates the Consortium for the Study of Writing in College, a joint effort of the National Survey of Student Engagement and the Council of Writing Program Administrators. In addition to the textbooks he has written, Professor Paine is author of The Resistant Writer, Rhetoric as Immunity, and with Joseph Harris and John Miles, he co-edited a collection of new essays teaching with student texts. In this session, our speakers will discuss teaching two types of argument: generative argument, power with, and persuasive argument, power over. Their starting point is the idea that our students have been told that argument is primarily about persuasion and exerting power over others. They learn then that argument is a tool for defending their beliefs, confronting others, attacking weak logic, and reinforcing positions. In other words, persuasive argument is the rhetoric of battle or conflict. In today's networked culture, though, the importance of generative rhetoric has grown dramatically because students need to learn how to shape the flow of information and exert power with others. Using generative strategies, students need to learn how to frame and reframe ideas, create identification, use narratives, and negotiate with others. Because both generative and persuasive argument are important in today's culture, Rick and Chuck will focus on ways of teaching students to use both types of argument. Guys, are you ready to get started?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Yeah, I think we are ready.
Okay, great. Which one of you are going to be presenting first?
That's I've got it's on my screen.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay.
You see my screen? Are we good?
Yes, sir. We're good.
Okay,
Go
thanks.
ahead. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll start us out by saying good afternoon and or good morning to many of you. So thanks for joining us over your lunch hour, or lunch is on the way. So anyway, we appreciate you tuning in. And you know, something that we're going to talk about today, Amy was kind of getting to this, but this has been a problem that's kind of bedeviled our field for a while as far as how to teach argument properly in a lot of ways. But it's become especially important more recently as our, you know, we've kind of moved into a network culture, network society, and even more, you know, more and more workplaces, educational environments are networked. And the idea of you know, the way argument's been taught for quite a long time is in a lot of ways becoming more and more problematic. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So, well, let's get started, Chuck. We'll flip it over to the next slide. You know, a long time, we all know this, that argument's kind of the controlling metaphor for argument has been this argument is war kind of approach to things. I mean, it's quite old and it's not new, and we've all tried to kind of work around this in some way. I think the consequences of this metaphor, especially more recently, is things are kind of starting to boil down to kind of yes it is, no it isn't kind of quarrels that you get to see on Fox News or MSNBC and stuff like that. There are battles of sound bites and gotcha statements, you know, people trying to score points and stuff like that. And, you know, one thing that kind of bothers us even more than that is this kind of derision of alternative views that's going on. It's like, well, if you don't agree with me, I'm going to deride you. And we kind of see that coming out in our classrooms. Well, I see it quite a bit. I mean, as much as I try to avoid it, it's this idea that other people are wrong because they're like dumb or stupid or something like that. And we think that's really not the essence of argument if you think about it. And even more troubling in a lot of ways is the silence that I think students are starting to adopt, and people in our culture in general, which is basically you have a sense that people disagree with you, so you're just going to be quiet, not say anything. and sit there and stew about it and even refuse to participate. And I think this is kind of where we're getting to with this argument of war metaphor. If it's a battle of attrition, why would anybody willingly participate in this kind of activity? So what we've been trying, so we've been asking, like a lot of people, it's like, well, argument's really war. Well, no, of course not. It's a metaphor, and like any metaphor, it's patently false at its core. One side of the argument is almost never declared the winner or loser. All right, those moments are rare in argument. The need to attack or defend attack others or defend your position, that's the exception, not usually the norm. And if you think about it, people are rarely really persuaded to change their mind about controversial topics. When was the last time someone talked to you or said, I think you're right, I'm changing my mind? Okay, those times are not all that common. They happen occasionally, but for the most arguments are quite different than that. In fact, the great majority of the arguments are really conversations among people who tend to agree more than they disagree, and if they change their views, it's very gradual. Those moments of winning and losing really aren't there. So the question is, and this is, looking at our textbooks, this kind of critique of our textbooks in our field, they overwhelmingly stress the idea that we're teaching students how to defend their claims, stand up for themselves, confront the ideas of others, attack the weak points of other people's arguments, reinforce their positions. We keep using this metaphor, even though I think most of us feel kind of uncomfortable about it and wouldn't even go with it. And then when we talk about, then we offer also, our textbooks offer something like an alternative view occasionally, like Toulmin views or Burke or something like that, but they don't really treat them very seriously. They're always kind of this sidelight of this extra chapter that's thrown in there. So Chuck and I have been trying to work on solving this problem, and that's what large argument today is a lot about. So I'm going to hand this over to Chuck for the next few slides.
Yeah, people are always bemoaning these sad state of argument, just as literacy always seems to be in crisis, argument always seems to be in crisis. And a lot of us look back fondly with nostalgia on the Lincoln-Douglas debate, say, oh, if only Americans had the huge attention spans they had back then, I mean, everything would be just fine. When instead we're in this terrible state where where shows like Crossfire have taken over, the popular culture, imagination of what argument is. And so here's the picture of Crossfire. This is the sort of argument that Rick was talking about, argument equals war. And if I'm not mistaken, Crossfire actually is no longer even being shown because it's actually too tame, right? But so this is one place that our students get their idea of argument as war, is through public culture. And by the way, it's not just our students, but their elders. But I like to point out that it goes back further than that. And here's Walter Ong in a book that he wrote, I don't know, I think it was in the 60s, Fighting for Life, on the litigious Greek world. As he points out, debate in Athens was an assembly, a getting together to discourse, was rather essentially a mobilization for a contest. The assembly came together to debate, to match pros and cons, to struggle, not fatally, but seriously and in dead earnest, man against man. So these go way back. It's not just contemporary culture, but it's actually kind of part of the Western consciousness. So the point is that argument is war is deeply embedded in our students' culture. It's not something we're just going to root out by giving them a new definition. And as Rick was saying, this is a problem that Rick and I identified. I think we both identified it when we were still in graduate school and struggled with, and tried to figure out how can we get students to rethink this argument as war metaphor. And one thing we realized is you can't just tell them, to have alternative forms of argument. So, and here, this is Abby Knobloch in a 3Cs article from a few years ago, basically saying what Rick and I are arguing right here is the frustration that we were talking about. She looks at the leading textbooks on our argument, and she writes, and I'm just going to read this, I hope you don't mind. These textbook author editors contrast argument marked by quarreling, fighting, winning, defeating opposition, and, on the other hand, working against others with, on the other hand, mature reasoning, civil conversation, mediation, and truth-seeking. As she points out, but a closer look at argument-based textbooks reveals a much more traditional definition of argument, even in those texts in which the author-editors seem to be consciously moving away from the argument as quarreling definitions. And that, so Rick and I were thinking, well, what can we do that's different? And these are ideas that I think all of us share, and we've shared these for at least decades about what we want students to understand about argument. We want to have them listen carefully to the views of others. We often use the metaphor of academic writing and academic argument as conversation. We also want them to read closely so that they really do understand the positions. One of my outcomes is that students can articulate an opposing opinion in a way that would make somebody who believes that opinion say, yes, that's exactly what I feel. And we want them to be critical thinkers, right? How to see both sides of the issue, how to understand their own biases and their own assumptions. We want them to understand how evidence works, why evidence is necessary, when it's needed and when it isn't. And we also want them for argument to be epistemic, right? A process for them to figure out what they believe and why they believe it. And of course, we want them to be able to express their views clearly to other people. And so we get this from this idea of habits of mind. We really are teaching students to think about ideas, issues in complex ways. And we want them to get into that habit of mind. We want them, it's not just a skill. Also, we think that argumentation, the way we teach argument, needs to consciously and deliberately prepare students for the writing and argument that they're going to be doing in their later courses, whether they're an economics major, a history major, a engineering student, or whatever. So prepare them for those courses and for the world and for the work world that they're after college, which is now highly networked and depends more than ever on multimodal communication and cooperation. So we borrowed this idea of argument awareness from some of the scholarship on genre awareness, and people like Amy Devitt and Anis Bawarshi, Joanne Reif talk about this idea of genre awareness. And basically, just as there's no one kind of communication that, called academic writing, there's no such thing really as academic argument. We really want our students to understand that that argument, like all communication, is shaped by particular contexts. It's rhetorical. There's an element of kairos in there. And what counts as a good argument is always context specific, and they're shaped by the values, needs, and goals and ideologies of the readers. I'm going to suggest that argument awareness is a kind of threshold concept, and threshold concept is actually something that's fairly new to me. I think it is one of the next big things in composition studies, and the idea of a threshold concept is that we're teaching, it is kind of a habit of mind, and the idea is that Myers and Land, in a great book that they call Overcoming Barriers to Student Understanding, talk about is that we want to if we want our students to think like an economist, or think like a mathematician, or an engineer, there's certain concepts in every discipline that students really need to master. So, for instance, in economics, it's opportunity cost. In media studies, it's the idea of the distinction between high and low culture, high and popular culture. In hermeneutics and literary studies, it's something like intention, right? But these are ideas that students have to understand and really get before they can move through. So what are the threshold concepts in argument? Well, first of all, threshold concepts are transformatives. They are like putting on a pair of glasses that the student sees the world in a different way. They're integrative. They see connections that they didn't see before. They're irreversible. Once you put that pair of glasses on, you can't take them off. Your view has been changed forever. They're liminal in that we try to help students approach them and pass through them. And I want to focus on this last one, this idea of troublesomeness. And that is that students resist them because they require them to question their previous perspectives. And so the question is, well, how do we get students unstuck? And I want to say that the argument is not war, is troublesome because it is so ingrained in student consciousness. And Rick and I were responding to the problem that we saw in our classrooms, which is how do we get students over this threshold, how past this liminal state? And it's not easy. One thing we could do, we could have them read the rhetorical tradition. Boy, we could have them read Kenneth Burke, right? But I personally don't have that much time in my class to take them through the rhetoric of motives or the grammar of motives. That isn't the way we wanted to do it. So instead, what we wanted to do was we wanted to reframe the idea of argument. And one of the things that, Burke is as responsible as anybody in the rhetorical tradition is this idea of rhetoric as identification, this generative side of identification, of argument. And so what we do, instead of framing argument as, okay, here's classical argument, which is about persuasion and having power over others, and then we're going to look at these alternative, more generative forms of argument, we wanted from the very beginning to frame argument as being on a spectrum, being on a continuum, and that you're always looking through this metaphor of the slider, of where you want to be when you're making an argument. We want this to be the lens through which students look at argument. So rather than generative arguments, these alternative arguments as being seen as an alternative, we want to point out how generative and persuasion are always operating together. Rick?
Yeah, and I also wanted to point out that some of this language comes from William Trevino, who talks a bit. I saw a presentation by him, and he's talked about this idea of generative versus arresting rhetoric. We're adapting some of that language. So, well, okay, so let's talk about what a better approach to argument might look like. Now, these things are a spectrum. Of course, there's no absolutely generative or absolutely persuasive argument, but I don't think it hurts to tell students that generally there's two types of argument that you're working with. Generative arguments tend to be arguments in groups, kind of like this one that you're seeing over here on the left. People are kind of in a network, they're talking, they're conversing, they're kind of discussing things. On the right, persuasion arguments tend to be a little more like you have a writer-speaker who's stepping forward, and then there's a little more of a defined audience that's over there. And what we're saying is that, the one type is more of a power-with type of approach to arguing that students need to know how to use, and the other one's a power-over. Now, here's a more defined generative approach to arguments here. We think these are the ones that people do all the time in workplaces, in classrooms, team projects. They're negotiating, they're brainstorming, they're planning together, they're using social networking. Like they say here, they're happening in email, blogs, Facebook, Twitter. All this stuff's having these very much power-with kinds of arguments going on. People are working together to build kind of a mutual understanding and kind of sort out their differences. Persuasion arguments, which we're calling power-over arguments, are a bit different. They're the ones where somebody's going to basically, write an essay and try and persuade people to believe what they want. They're going to exert power over them in some fashion. That's not a negative thing. I mean, there are times when you have to try and exert power over others. But that's not all the time, and in fact, it's not even most of the time. What we're saying is the vast majority of the time you're exerting power with people, and then occasionally you're asked to make a speech, offer a sales pitch, write a business proposal, sermonize. I mean, all these things. These kinds are important kinds of arguments too. We think that the balance of power has been put over on this side a little too much. All right, so what are some strategies for generative arguments? This is where we're going to get to some specifics. We thought there's 4 basic strategies that you can teach the students. First, teach them how to build a sense of identification with their audience and with others. Second, learn how to frame issues specifically to your advantage, but basically to the advantage of everyone. Learning how to tell interesting stories is kind of a strategy 3 that we could teach students how to do, and then strategy 4 is how to negotiate disagreements when they come up in some way. So let's go into each one of these specifically. Identification, I mean, obviously we're taking this from Burke, but I mean, it's really simpler than that. It's really just reaching out to show others that you share or at least respect their values, upbringing, experiences, or status. And I think Burke's kind of correct on this. People don't change their minds because you use stronger reasoning. They rarely do. They will agree with you if they think that you respect their values, or at least that you share their values in some way, that you have something in common you can identify with each other. Sometimes you use a shared problem to build a sense of identity with each other. If you may be very different from someone, but if you share a problem, often that's a good way to identify with them. We also think it's important to avoid scapegoating or pandering. Even Burke was very concerned about that, seeing how it was used in Nazi Germany to basically to scapegoat a group and build identity through that. He was very concerned about that, and so would we. So we try and avoid teaching students how to do those things. The second strategy is to learn how to frame issues. We're kind of taking this from George Lakoff's idea of framing. He also uses metaphor in this way. I understand how arguments are already being framed. All right. In other words, every argument works within certain frames, and teaching students how to frame arguments in positive terms according to your and your audience's values. Lakoff's classic example is how Republicans for a long time successfully framed issues as tax relief. Well, Democrats would find themselves arguing against tax relief. Well, that's kind of a bad move. The one is a positive frame that sounds very positive and moving in the right direction, and as soon as the Democrats would adopt that negative frame, they would find themselves on the defensive. This happens all the time. You can teach students how to reframe things, frame things in positive terms that make things work better, and avoid getting into these negative frames that actually put their arguments in an unfavorable light. And then conceptual metaphors are especially helpful. We don't have a lot of time to go into that, but metaphors in particular can be used to frame and reframe things so people see things from different perspectives. The third strategy, I'll wait for this, which is narrative. Narrative often comes into composition in the form of personal experience papers. I think we could do a lot more than that. I think students should always be looking for ways to use stories to make their points. People are very attracted to stories, and I think in a network culture, the stories are even more dominant and necessary than ever, because often people need that contextualization to really understand the point of what's being express them. Anecdotes are very helpful. Teaching students how to look for anecdotes that illustrate their concepts. Even hypothetical examples are sometimes more effective when we teach students how to use those. And even fables or parables that tie into larger cultural themes. It's kind of funny. This is one that I often said that television is where we often get our own fables or parables. But even today, that's kind of falling apart in some ways because people aren't watching the same television shows anymore. So it used to be you could appeal to Seinfeld or something, but it doesn't work that way anymore. So, well, the fourth strategy is negotiation. There are times when disagreements happen. That doesn't mean we go to war. That means we try and figure out what the problem is. We teach students how to demonstrate that how they value and understand other people's opinions, figuring out where others' positions are valid, figuring out situations where the student's position is valid, and explaining how both sides would benefit if elements from both sides were adopted. This is some people call this Rogerian rhetoric. It's actually just mediation strategies and negotiation strategies that work out quite well. So let me kind of wrap up here this part of the discussing generative strategies. Really what we're asking students to do is strive for consensus while valuing dissensus. Power with forms of arguments consensus isn't the necessary end point. It's more something we strive for. And if we reach it, that's fine. If we don't reach it, that's okay too. We still have some things to talk about. And dissensus, we got to teach students that dissensus should be valued. We should encourage people to speak up. Because that's what allows people to be creative, be more aware, work things out. When people are silenced, that's when we've got the problem, not when people keep talking. That's the sign of good generative arguments, is when people keep talking, the ongoing conversation's happening. It's failure when people are silenced or being silenced in some way. So I'm going to hand this over to Chuck then for the next part. Chuck, are you still there?
Sorry, I had myself unmuted. I was going on and on. Okay. So I guess my guess is that all of you are fairly familiar with both sides of this generative and persuasive side that we're cutting the world up into, and perhaps more so with the persuasive side that I'm going to talk to. And I keep using this metaphor of sides, which really is a simplification. I mean, as Rick and I are trying to point out in this presentation and throughout argument today, even when you're in so-called persuasive mode, you're on that side of the slider, you're going to be using some of the generative strategies and vice versa. It's when you're arguing generative, you don't avoid evidence or anything like that. So there really is a lot of, it's definitely a lot of crossover on these things. The point is that there is this simple frame that we're giving students to think about it so that they can go deeper into these ideas. So basically, the strategies that we talk about for persuasive arguments are supporting claims with reason, authority, and emotion, ethos, pathos, and logos. Something actually more and more students are coming to us from high school with. Understanding how evidence works and how to support your claims, using commonplaces to structure an argument, and also avoiding fallacies. So, and we all know about logos, ethos, and pathos. We want, again, this is a sort of arbitrary, artificial way of cutting up the way even arguments work, but it's one way of thinking about them, and really powerful for a lot of students, and even for me. So, in reasoning, of course, is using logic, both inductive and deductive logic. Authority is using your reputation, wearing a, if you're in a commercial, wearing a lab coat or something like that, and also just fair-mindedness, showing that you understand, a little bit like identification, that you're a fair person, a good-thinking person, that you have their best interests in mind. And of course, pathos, which, I know a lot of brain scientists nowadays are saying that really it's all about emotion, that's how we actually influence people, it's all through pathos. But these help students understand those three strategies. In terms of evidence, how does, we want students to know how to use it. We want students to understand how to evaluate the evidence of others and evaluate their own evidence. So there's research involved here. How do we gather electronic, print, and empirical evidence, and how do we tell if it really is authoritative and accurate? When we gather images and graphics, how do we give credit for it? How do we make sure that we're using these fairly? And then finally, evaluating evidence. We're taking this from Richard Fulkerson. I love this, the STAR method. A way of evaluating, asking these questions about any bit of evidence. Is it sufficient, right? Is it typical, or are you cherry picking? Is it accurate, right? And is it reliable, right? Can you trust the source? The third strategy, of course, is using commonplaces. And the commonplaces are basically moves that we're always using. Making a definition, negation, showing the two sides of something, comparing, slicing things up into two parts, comparison and contrasts. These are sometimes called the modes, but we're preferring to call these the commonplaces. Again, these are things that you'll do in generative argument as well, but we're placing them over here just to help students understand how it works. And then these are commonplaces more along the Aristotelian commonplaces, this second bullet here. The better or worse, qualification, counterstatement. These are the moves that we want students to know how to make and to have terms for, so that they can make them and get practice with them. So, and then finally, of course, we want the students always have a lot of fun with fallacies, right? Is how to avoid fallacies, and this is nothing real new here. I think all the fallacies under the sun have been identified long ago by the Greeks and Romans. But one thing, this last point I want to point out, is that we like to stress that it is impossible to make a real argument that couldn't be said to have at least one fallacy, right? But what this attention to fallacy does is allows readers to engage with other people's arguments more fully and to evaluate their own argument a little more carefully. So what do we want? What do we want our students to do? Even though they are doing persuasive rhetoric, they're doing power over. We want them still to listen to the others, right? And we want them to know that sometimes you're much more interested in, you kind of have your mind made up, and you're really trying to influence people to your side. But still, we want them to understand that there's always a generative aspect to argument, and so it needs to be flexible and responsive to other viewpoints. You know, this is not like a presidential debate or, you know, the talking heads on, you know, on MSNBC or Fox, right? And then finally, we want students to think about, as Aristotle puts it, the ability to see what are the available means of persuasion in any particular case. We want them to have a sense of kairos and an understanding that each situation needs a different set of strategies. Rick, do you want to talk a little about genres?
Yeah, and I just, you know, I wanted to point out that, you know, what we're not suggesting is people abandon the way argument's been taught. What we're almost arguing is that they should be expanded in a legitimate way. Instead of seeing these generative arguments as kind of supplemental or alternative forms of rhetoric for those vegetarians out there who don't want to really argue with people, we're really saying, no, this is all very important kinds of argument, especially in a networked multimodal world. That these persuasive arguments, yes, these are very important kinds of arguments to make, but more and more of these generative arguments are the dominant form of rhetoric in our society, where people are basically arguing through networks and in networks, working in groups and collaborating and things like that. So a concept that we think holds this all together is the concept of genres, and that's something that we focused on for a long time. Again, like a generative argument, genre is kind of in the middle of that. Everyone in the kind of circle understands, kind of has a sense of the genre. It's a construction that they all understand, so they know what's going on, they know how the argument works, and they can kind of talk through the genre. Same thing with a persuasive argument, is that there's, you know, we like to think of genres as places where writers and their audiences come and together and make meaning together in some sense, and the genre in some sense mediates that, you know, that activity. So what are some good genres of argument that we think students should be taught in an argument class? The ones on the left here on this slide generally look more, you know, they're generative: description, comparison, causal analysis, visual essays, narrative arguments. These tend to be generative. They have their persuasive elements, but they're a little further over on the left on that slider scale that we showed earlier. And on the right, these tend to be a little more persuasive arguments. There where somebody's kind of trying to win someone over to their side in some way. Reviews, evaluations, commentaries, refutations, proposals. We kind of put research papers and reports down here at the bottom because they can take on elements of all sides. Sometimes they're very generative. They're collecting information, sharing that information, analyzing it, presenting it. Sometimes they are persuasive, making recommendations, trying to change people's minds in some way. So these are the genres we think a good argument class can probably incorporate to get both sides of that slider scale. Why use it? Genres in particular, that's a pretty good question. I mean, these are things that are going to transfer to advanced courses. When I write proposals, reports, reviews, this is stuff that they really got to know, and it translates well into upper classes. We're putting a lot of emphasis on transfer these days. It also, you know, we think they offer students opportunities to argue effectively in both generative and persuasive rhetorical situations. And, you know, frankly, they're pretty learnable. I mean, that's if you've never taught from the genre approach, you start finding, wow, they really pick up on this, they understand it, they're applicable to a lot of rhetorical situations, and even more so as assessment becomes an important component of our courses, they're pretty accessible too. I mean, you can use genres as a cornerstone of assessment in some ways. So I'm going to bring Chuck back in here just for kind of to get us into our last few slides. Chuck, you want to talk a little bit more about thresholds? I seem to be losing Chuck here. Chuck, you're muted, I think.
Yeah, sorry. Boy, I was just going on and on. Anyway.
Muting you on purpose.
Well, I don't want you to hear me coughing and going out for coffee and donuts. But, yeah, I want to point out that some of the same strategies we use to get students to these threshold concepts and and through them are the same ones that are really important for transfer. And by the way, down here I have this Elizabeth Warder, and I have this in a rhetoric for writing teachers. Boy, I just noticed that's wrong. It's a rhetoric for writing program administrators. It's edited by Rita Malenchik, not Erica Lindemann. But this and these sort of basic ideas about how do we teach transfer. What they stress is we need to give students a way of thinking about writing, because we want students to become flexible learners who don't think that every writing situation is going to get the exact same treatment. So we want to teach them flexible approaches to rhetorical problem solving. We want to incorporate strategies that encourage transfer, such as teaching concepts and heuristics rather than rigid rules, right? Teaching students to self-monitor, teaching rhetorical awareness, and giving them metaphors, analogy, and also giving them a critical terminology that they can use. And that critical terminology needs to be simple but robust. Otherwise, they're not going to take it with them. And some of the more complicated argumentative strategies like Toolman can be so complicated that students really are not going to use it after the class is over. And so we think that this simple way, this basic way of looking at an argument, first asking yourself, where am I on this generative persuasive scale, is simple and powerful. So, Rick, why don't you take us out?
Yeah, I think I think that we are in a kind of transition phase. I think many of us feel that way, and so our teaching of argument needs to shift. We need to shift it towards something that's going to work in the workplace these days, in network workplaces. They're becoming much more dynamic and fluid in a way that power with is becoming vastly more important than it's ever been. It's always been important, but now especially it's important, more than the power over dynamic. That's not saying students don't need to learn to argue in power over ways. What we're saying is that it's both. We need to give them both ways. We also think the genre approach allows us to anyway, and there's our email addresses. So if you would like to contact us about it and talk about these ideas, we'd be more than willing to talk with you more. They are coming out in a new book, as Amy said, called Argument Today. So that's probably the best expression of it on how we're trying to present these ideas. So, and we're open to your questions.
Thanks so much, guys. We have a really, I think, a really interesting question here from Tian Ko, who asks, many U.S. public speakers and writers use the idea of compromise, the ideas of compromise and consensus as a kind of false front to present the external appearance of all-roundedness and openness. How would you explain generative argument to international or multicultural American students who may come from communities where persuasive arguments are dominant and valued forms of rhetoric in daily life?
Wow, that's a good question. Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think it's interesting. It's at Purdue we have about 20% of our student body is international. And actually, what bothers them is our form of argument, which is always this: I've got to win this thing, or I'm not going to argue at all. And so I actually think a lot of cultures are a little put off by sometimes the way we teach argument, which involves getting ready to go to battle in some sense. They're always kind of like, "What's the battle? Can we just talk this out?" In some ways. And so I think that's kind of I think that's part of it, but I think, and as far as the false front for reaching consensus, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think that's a cynical way of looking at things. I think it's nice to extend and offer the idea that consensus is going to be possible and that we're actually trying to reach consensus. I don't think those moves are disingenuous all the time. I can imagine there's some times when they are. But for the most part, I think we need to teach students how to reach out and extend that hand to others and say, I want to work with you. I want to network and get into a conversation with you in that way. It's not always a false front in that I don't know. John, what do you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, no, I think our students are really good. The irony is the world they swim in. They don't even realize they're doing them. They don't even realize when they're being ironic and sarcastic. I'd much rather teach students authenticity, and how to, be serious arguers. But that idea of consensus and compromise as a front, that is true. It can be used cynically. One of the slides we had up front was from House of Cards. And if you watch that show, you know that the villain hero, Frank Underwood, is a master of pretending to be engaging in generative rhetoric when it's all about power. So yes, anything can be turned around. The other thing I'd say about international students and second language learners is that one of the ideas behind a genre approach in the way we're doing this is to lay bare, right, what Myers and Land call the underlying game, how it works. And we also want them to become skillful at looking at situations, brand new situations, and figuring out what is the underlying game here. And I think the terminology and the strategies that we try to help students master are ways that they can do it. So, and I think all students need that, and maybe especially helpful for international students.
Thanks, guys. And another question that came in from Sumita Roy, she was asking, can you give some examples of self-monitoring?
Self-monitoring is a kind of reflection, a kind of metacognition, a kind of self-evaluation. In my classes, my students reflect, turn in some sort of written reflection every single week. So what we want students to be able to do is to make their own judgments about how well they're doing, right? We all know, maybe we were at one time the kind of students who will say things like, well, how was your paper? Well, I'm not sure. I haven't gotten it back from my teacher. So one kind of self-monitoring is just doing that self-evaluation and making that a habit of mind. So does that answer your question?
I guess we'll know if she comes back with nope. But
it doesn't?
No, says yes. So there we go. Let me ask you one last thing. This is from Ellen Susi. It says it might be helpful to contrast, quote, the illusory unanimity of groupthink, end quote, with genuine generative argumentation. And she also thanks you for this webinar and says that she loves it. So anyway, if you want to talk to that groupthink versus generative argumentation distinction.
Yeah, we actually talk about groupthink in the book as kind of where forced consensus actually starts to create. I mean, that's a big part of it. I mean, if you're going to teach generative rhetoric, you have to teach students that dissensus is something that's valued. And that's, groupthink's the dark side of that, when basically, we saw this, I think, in the run-up to the Iraq War, where people were basically not listening to alternative voices anymore. They were basically shutting themselves in a room and forcing consensus on people and acting like everyone was coming to an agreement. What you got to teach people to do is that consensus is not the ultimate aim of generative rhetoric. The ultimate aim is keep fostering that conversation that keeps going. And one way of doing that is, hey, sometimes you got to check in. You got to say, all right, what would someone else say? What would a devil's advocate say here? What would encouraging people to step forward in some way and offer dissenting views in that way. And I think that's a big antidote to the kind of groupthink that sometimes goes on in the name of consensus.
Right. Yeah, and this is the reason. And one of the things that we know for any effective organization is diversity. And the other side of this is that students need to learn to argue with people with diverse viewpoints and value diverse viewpoints, and to be able to listen to them, take them into account, so that groupthink is less likely to happen. I mean, this has to do with what we're talking about in the economic meltdown of 2008, and and a lot of very good arguments, in my opinion, are it never would have happened if if these large corporations had more women on them, because they offer a diverse viewpoint that just isn't there, that isn't currently there.
Well, thank you guys so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we've gotten so many comments from people saying thank you and expressing so much appreciation for what you've had to say here. And of course, I thank you very much as well.
Well, thanks for letting us do this. This was it was fun.
Yeah,
It's always great to talk with you guys. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks. All right.